How did the war machine, once considered the most invincible in the world, drown in its own arrogance within a boundless white hell? In this documentary, we will embark on a deep journey into the dark corridors of Operation Barbarossa, the largest and most ruthless military invasion plan human history had ever recorded up to that day. Together, we will watch how more than 3 million soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and massive air fleets were slowly swallowed by the unforgiving geography of the East. First, we will witness the crushing power of that colossal steel storm breaching the borders. Then we will deeply feel the cold silence of the deadly sieges where millions were trapped in Kiev and Leningrad. Ultimately, we will see step by step how the freezing Russian winter and the relentless fury of the Red Army shattered the supposedly invincible lightning war doctrine at the gates of Moscow. At the conclusion of this dark narrative, together we will bring to light the absolute truth of how the course of history irreversibly shifted in the desperate battle of steel against nature and human will. If this journey we take, accompanied by this slow-paced and sleep-friendly historical narrative, resonates with you, you might consider subscribing to our World War II History for Sleep channel and liking the video. Furthermore, we kindly ask you to share your valuable suggestions and recommendations for future documentaries in the comments section. Now we are setting off back to the misty summer months of 1941, to the very day that dark decision dictating the fate of the entire world was made. Let us step together into the quiet beginning of the colossal tragedy, written by steel, cold, and blood. On the morning of June 22nd, 1941, exactly as the clock struck 3:15, the east of the European continent awoke to a military violence unprecedented in history. Along the immense front line, stretching approximately 1,000 miles from the shores of the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, thousands of German guns fired simultaneously, down to the exact second. The pitch-black night turned into a deadly and ceaseless crimson that engulfed the entire horizon. Tens of thousands of tons of steel and high explosives hurled from the barrels rained mercilessly down upon the Soviet barracks, ammunition dumps, communication lines, and transport networks guarding the border. The terrifying mechanical shrieks produced by the multi-barreled rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer batteries, tore through the freezing silence of the morning. Thousands of Red Army soldiers in a deep slumber along the borderlands lost their lives directly in their beds and guardhouses before they even comprehended what was happening. The artillery bombardment was so intense, so systematic, and relentless that the earth in the border regions was practically uprooted, century-old trees shattered in seconds, and a thick scent of cordite blanketed the air. As the artillery fire ruthlessly pounded the borderlines, a vastly different wave of destruction set into motion. Upon the issuance of the order, the German High Command, OKW, initiated the most colossal logistical buildup military history ever witnessed up to that day. The sheer scale of the operation was so immense that no movement could possibly remain entirely hidden. Yet the German command echelon managed this buildup with profound strategic mastery. Throughout the spring months of 1941, hundreds of infantry and armored divisions were transported to the east by countless train journeys from all corners of Europe. Logistics centers, ammunition depots, massive refueling points, and field hospitals were silently shifted to the borders of East Prussia and occupied Poland. Locomotives rolling through the dead of night relentlessly carried machines of war to the Soviet border. Panzer divisions, artillery batteries, and over 3 million well-equipped soldiers began to wait for the hour of attack beneath camouflage nets, deep within the giant forests along the borderlands. On the other side of the border, the Soviet intelligence network tracked this enormous military mobilization moment by moment. Double agents, reports from border villages, photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft during border violations, and the direct observations of border guards turned into a ceaseless flood of intelligence flowing toward Moscow. High-ranking intelligence officers like Richard Sorge, the Soviet agent in Japan, and even some German soldiers who defected across the border, explicitly reported the exact date of the invasion. All the reports pointed to the exact same concrete reality. A massive German army took a full attack position at the border, and the countdown started. However, these vital and definitive warnings failed to find the expected resonance in the cold corridors of the Kremlin. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin dismissed all the intelligence reports placed on his desk as British provocations. In Stalin's mind, an unshakable belief existed that Hitler would never attempt a two-front suicide before ending the war with England. He strictly adhered to the non-aggression pact signed with Germany in 1939 and avoided even the slightest military precaution that might provoke the Germans. Strict orders were issued to the border troops not to go on high alert, not to ready the anti-aircraft batteries for fire, and not to respond to potential border violations. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were left entirely motionless and defenseless by their leader's command, resting in the shadow of this colossal war machine, whose barrels aimed directly at them. The tension at the border reached its boiling point. Time slowly ran out, and the east of Europe silently drifted toward the deadliest dawn in history. On the morning of June 22, 1941, exactly as the clock struck 3:15, the east of the European continent awoke to a military violence unprecedented in history. Along the immense front line, stretching approximately 1,000 miles from the shores of the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, thousands of German guns fired simultaneously, down to the exact second. The pitch-black night turned into a deadly and ceaseless crimson that engulfed the entire horizon. Tens of thousands of tons of steel and high explosives hurled from the barrels rained mercilessly down upon the Soviet barracks, ammunition dumps, communication lines, and transport networks guarding the border. The terrifying mechanical shrieks produced by the multi-barreled rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer batteries, tore through the freezing silence of the morning. Thousands of Red Army soldiers in a deep slumber along the borderlands lost their lives directly in their beds and guardhouses before they even comprehended what was happening. The artillery bombardment was so intense, so systematic, and relentless that the earth in the border regions was practically uprooted, century-old trees shattered in seconds, and a thick scent of cordite blanketed the air. As the artillery fire ruthlessly pounded the border lines, a vastly different wave of destruction set into motion in the high and dark layers of the sky. Colossal air fleets belonging to the Luftwaffe, consisting of Junkers and Heinkel bombers, accompanied by Messerschmitt fighter planes, took off from their runways just before the dawn fully broke. Their targets were not chosen at random. They were strategic Soviet air bases, pinpointed with millimeter precision through months of high-altitude reconnaissance flights. The Soviet Air Force, dwelling in a dangerous complacency, brought by peacetime, lined up their warplanes wing to wing on the tarmacs, all in a single row and in an extremely orderly fashion. A vast majority of the anti-aircraft batteries remained covered and were left without ammunition. Gliding down from above, German pilots caught these massive targets completely asleep and defenseless. When the bombs found their marks with dead accuracy, Soviet planes transformed into enormous fireballs one after another, before they could even start their engines, and before their pilots could reach the cockpits. In this merciless air raid that lasted only a few hours, thousands of Soviet warplanes burned to the ground and turned into piles of scrap iron. This absolute and instantaneous annihilation in the sky granted the German army undisputed air superiority in the immense heavens of the Eastern Front during the ensuing months. Right after the rain of destruction, the colossal war machine on the ground roared its engines and lunged forward. The rivers forming the border, especially the Bug River, which posed a strategic obstacle, were rapidly crossed by German infantry and combat engineers under the thick morning fog. Vanguard units crossing to the opposite bank of the river with inflatable boats infiltrated the Soviet trenches. Meanwhile, highly trained Brandenburg commandos, wearing Soviet uniforms, infiltrated the border bridges in advance and silently neutralized the bewildered Soviet border guards who were preparing to blow the bridges up. The bridges of vital importance were captured entirely intact. As the dawn fog slowly dispersed, the massive panzer divisions, commanded by General Guderian and General Hoth, made a mass entry into Soviet territory, crossing these bridges accompanied by the earth-shattering sounds of their steel tracks and throat-burning exhaust fumes. The NKVD troops and outposts tasked with guarding the border were completely caught off guard by a raid of such incomprehensible scale and coordination. German special forces cut all telephone wires, and radio stations were struck down. Because the communication lines completely collapsed, no surviving Soviet commander at the border managed to contact the higher headquarters, receive any orders, or relay the gravity of the situation to Moscow. The Soviet defensive line plunged into chaos, paralysis, and darkness within the very first hours. What unfolded along the border went down in history not as a clash of two armies, but as a heavy, steel steamroller passing over an unprepared obstacle and crushing it completely. The absolute chaos experienced on the borderline in the early hours of Operation Barbarossa gave way to a cold-blooded, mechanical, and deadly order as the day dawned. Over 3 million German soldiers, bearing the title of the most formidable land army history ever recorded up to that day, began to pour into the depths of the Soviet Union. The German High Command divided this colossal offensive into three, based on geographical and strategic objectives. Each army group was designed as an independent machine of destruction in its own right, and the route of each became a distinct steel spearhead piercing the heart of the Soviet geography. The suffocating heat of late June and the massive dust clouds rising from the drying dirt roads made the advance of these three giants visible even from the high heavens. At the northernmost tip of the front, the Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, mobilized. Their objective was to swiftly cut through the Baltic states and reach Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. The northern geography did not offer a forgiving or easy terrain for the armored divisions. Dense and dark pine forests, impassable swamps, and narrow, primitive dirt roads strained the tracks of the 4th Panzer Group, commanded by General Erich Höppner. Nevertheless, German motorized infantry and armor carved through the misty forests of Lithuania and Latvia with a ruthless and rhythmic pace. Before the Soviet defensive lines could fully comprehend what was happening or the scale of the attack, German vanguard units seized riverbeds and strategic forest roads one by one. The heavy roars of engines and the grinding of tank tracks echoing through the depths of century-old woods shifted rapidly eastward from the Baltic shores toward the outskirts of Leningrad. The true devastating blow of the invasion, however, was dealt in the center by the Army Group Center under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. The heaviest, most hard-hitting, and most numerically massive armored forces possessed by the German army were concentrated within the ranks of this group. The ultimate objective was directly the Soviet capital, Moscow, and the route was the historic, immense highway that Napoleon walked a century prior. The two colossal panzer groups commanded by General Heinz Guderian and General Hermann Hoth unleashed virtually a steel storm across the scorched plains of Belarus. Covering tens of kilometers a day, armored and motorized units tore through the Soviet lines like paper. The fine gray dust, kicked up by the tracks of armored vehicles, clung to the soldiers' faces, painted all the vehicles in a single color, and blotted out the sky. The advance of the Army Group Center was so swift, calculated, and merciless that the speed of the panzers long surpassed the marching pace of the trailing infantry. Guderian's tanks did not pause as they cleaved through the Soviet divisions. They left the task of annihilation to the infantry following behind and disappeared into the horizon. At the lowest section of the map, the Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, pushed into the boundless, flat, agricultural terrains of Ukraine. The South's objective was to capture Ukraine, the massive granary of the Soviets, reach the Dnieper River, bring down Kiev, and ultimately force open the gateway leading to the Caucasian oil. Compared to the forested or swampy terrains in the center and north, the Ukrainian steppes offered a flawless, smooth ground for armored warfare. Colossal wheat fields, shining golden yellow under the sun, undulated in the wind like ocean waves as they were ruthlessly crushed by the steel hulls of the advancing panzers. Tank tracks stretched eastward, tearing dark wounds across the massive farmlands. However, the Army Group South encountered a much denser, heavier, and better equipped Soviet armored resistance compared to the other two groups. The Red Army's most formidable armored corps were deployed in this region. In spite of this, German tactical superiority, the undisputed support of the Luftwaffe in the sky, and the coordination between artillery and armor melted away and repelled the numerically superior Soviet resistance step by step. By the end of the first days, the picture drawn on the map by these three mammoth army groups turned into an absolute doomsday scenario for the Soviet High Command. This immense wave consisting of millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, horse-drawn wagons, and motor vehicles devoured every obstacle in its path, pressing eastward like a gigantic and unbreakable wall of steel. The Red Army, in a state of profound shock, completely lost not only colossal tracts of land, but also the initiative of the war in the face of this mechanical, strictly disciplined, and unstoppable onslaught. From the very first days, the conflict broke away from stationary trench warfare and transformed into a giant mechanical hunt that slid across the map at an unprecedented velocity, wiping borders clean away. The colossal steel arms of the Army Group Center sprang into action to lay an unprecedented death trap across the plains of Belarus. Encirclement warfare, the very beating heart of German military doctrine, was brought to life across a vast geography with a flawless mechanical execution. General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group advanced from the north, and General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group from the south, moving simultaneously, despite the hundreds of kilometers separating them. Rather than colliding head-on with the Soviet armies directly ahead of them, these two gargantuan armored spearheads enveloped them from both flanks like a giant crab's claw and slipped behind their lines. The steel tracks of the panzers ruthlessly trampled the defenseless roads, bridges, and supply routes deep behind the Soviet lines. The armored units advancing from two wings united, exactly as planned, to the east of the Belarusian capital Minsk on June 27, 1941. The armored steel pincer snapped shut with a deafening roar. With the closing of the pincer, an absolute tragedy began for the forces of the Soviet Western Front, trapped in the massive terrain between Białystok and Minsk. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers, under the command of General Dmitry Pavlov, were left completely helpless between the German armor sweeping behind them and the Luftwaffe bombs raining down upon them. Communication lines severed entirely. The chain of command had no idea where its troops were or in which direction they needed to move. Massive Soviet KV-1 and T-34 tanks that ran out of fuel were blown up by the hands of their own crews, or abandoned to their fate in the depths of the woods. Soviet infantrymen facing starvation with depleted ammunition and severed logistical support desperately launched charges in waves toward German machine gun nests to break the encirclement. Yet, as the German infantry divisions caught up from behind and wove a thick wall of flesh and steel around the pocket, all final hopes of escape were thoroughly extinguished. By the first days of July, the armies of the Soviet Western Front squeezed inside the vast siege ring around Minsk effectively melted away. More than 300,000 Red Army soldiers began to march in colossal convoys stretching for miles, exhausted, wounded, and disarmed. Thousands of artillery pieces, thousands of tanks, and countless military vehicles were left on the battlefield as a massive heap of wreckage. The Soviet Western Front ceased to exist as a military structure and was wiped off the map entirely. The front commander General Pavlov, who bore the responsibility for this inconceivable debacle, was immediately arrested upon being recalled to Moscow and was executed by firing squad shortly after the disaster of his army. In a matter of just a few days, the German war machine swallowed and destroyed an entire army group in a single stroke. When the definitive news of this unbelievable defeat breached the thick walls of the Kremlin and was placed on the desk, it created an indescribable shockwave in Moscow. Joseph Stalin, who refused to address the public on the radio during the first days of the invasion, retreated into a deep, dark silence when he realized his armies were annihilated so quickly and so effortlessly. Crushed beneath the weight of reality, the Soviet leader abandoned the capital and withdrew to his summer estate in Kuntsevo, deep within the woods. For days he saw no one, issued no orders, and completely detached himself from government affairs. In the most critical days of the war, the fate of the Soviet Union was left entirely masterless as its leader locked his doors and plunged into darkness. On the outside, however, the massive and merciless German armor continued to forge eastward, kicking up dust and smoke straight down the road to a defenseless Moscow. Following the closing of the Minsk pocket and the erasure of the Soviet Western Front from the map in a colossal ruin, the Moscow highway stretched out before the Army Group Center almost like an unobstructed corridor. Wasting no time, and without letting their engines cool, the armored units of General Guderian and General Hoth thrust forward eastward once again, straight toward the city of Smolensk, the historic gateway to the capital. Smolensk served as the last great shield before Moscow, due to both its strategic geographical position and the massive railway and supply networks it harbored. The German High Command planned to swiftly encircle and topple this city in a matter of days, just like Minsk, and march directly upon the Kremlin without a pause. Yet in mid-July, on the shores of the Dnieper River and across the vast plains of Smolensk, the German war machine crashed into an exceptionally fierce, stubborn, and organized wall of resistance it never anticipated since the beginning of the campaign. After Joseph Stalin overcame his profound initial shock and reclaimed command, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, rapidly shifted all remaining reserve forces, newly formed armies from the interior regions, and fresh recruits to the Smolensk axis. The new Soviet troops under the command of Marshal Semyon Timoshenko did not merely wait in their trenches and stay on the defensive, unlike the preceding weeks. For the first time since the onset of the invasion, the Red Army mounted large-scale, coordinated, and extremely violent counterattacks. Heavy armored Soviet corps delivered unexpected and staggering blows to the flanks of the rapidly advancing German panzers. The character of the war abruptly changed before Smolensk. A one-sided rapid advance gave way to a bloody, heavy, grueling slaughter that crawled forward step by step. Strategic hills, river crossings, bridgeheads, and dark woodlands around the city changed hands for days, even weeks. The Soviets used their newly invented multi-barreled rocket launchers, dubbed Katyusha among the soldiers, en masse for the first time in history on this front at the Orsha station. The terrifying mechanical shrieks tearing through the sky as the Katyushas were fired, and their colossal destructive power that turned targets into a sea of fire in seconds created a profound psychological shock among the German infantry. The street fighting inside the city of Smolensk hosted the most savage scenes of the war up to that day. Buildings, factories, and historical structures were completely reduced to rubble by unending artillery fire and aerial bombardments. German forces had to fight for weeks, far beyond what was planned, to fully encircle the city and break the resistance. When the ring finally closed tight in early August, and over 300,000 more Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, there hung the dark shadow of an alarming delay rather than a victory to be celebrated in the German headquarters. The Battle of Smolensk halted the advance of the Army Group Center for nearly an entire month. The unstoppable, fluid tempo of the lightning war, Blitzkrieg, suffered a mortal wound for the first time at Smolensk. The panzer divisions lost a vast portion of their armored vehicles in these protracted and fierce engagements due to enemy fire or mechanical failures caused by excessive use. The prolongation of the battle and the eastward shift of the front line, hundreds of kilometers from its starting point, began to cause fatal cracks in the German logistical network, which was previously thought to operate flawlessly. Distancing themselves approximately 700 kilometers from the borderline, The German troops failed to receive the high-octane fuel, artillery ammunition, and basic rations they needed on time. The wider track gauge of the Soviet railway lines, compared to European standards, decisively prevented German supply trains from transporting materials directly to the front. Thousands of kilometers of Soviet railway tracks had to be torn up and relaid according to German standards. The inadequacy of the roads and the fine, abrasive Russian dust rising from dirt trails, melting the engine blocks of the vehicles, brought the supply lines to the point of paralysis. The crisis deepened even further as the first Soviet partisan groups, beginning to regroup in the depths of the forests, targeted the logistical convoys. The physical exhaustion of the soldiers reached its peak. Ammunition depots dropped to critical levels, and before reaching its ultimate goal, the German High Command bitterly realized before Smolensk that its colossal army began to run out of breath. The scorching heat of August 1941 mercilessly battered the immense Belarusian plains and the ruins of Smolensk. The German Army Group Center overcame the Smolensk obstacle at the cost of weeks of bloody clashes and heavy armored losses. The remnants of the Soviet Western Front scattered eastward. Before the panzer divisions commanded by General Heinz Guderian and General Hermann Hoth lay a broad historic highway with largely weakened defenses stretching directly into the heart of the Soviet Union, Moscow. As the soldiers rested in the shadow of their tanks, they expected to see the Kremlin domes of the capital appear on the horizon. However, the sound of gunfire on the front lines gave way to a silent yet devastating storm brewing hundreds of kilometers behind, at the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, headquarters, hidden among the dark and cool pine forests of East Prussia. The German High Command plunged into a massive strategic crisis that forever altered not only the course of Operation Barbarossa, but the ultimate fate of the entire war. The German Army High Command, OKH, particularly Chief of Staff General Franz Halder and Commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, General Heinz Guderian, insisted that military logic pointed in a single, definitive direction. According to classical Prussian military doctrine, ending the war with an absolute victory required annihilating the enemy's center of gravity, its heart, with a single fatal blow. This center was indisputably Moscow. Moscow did not simply stand as a political and ideological capital, but it also served as a colossal, vital nexus where the railway network, communication lines, administrative machinery, and military command structure of the entire Soviet geography converged. Halder and Guderian argued that the panzers needed to march relentlessly eastward before Russia's ruthless autumn rains and freezing winter set in, and before the Soviet army fully regrouped in the rear lines to construct new, insurmountable defensive perimeters. Time rapidly slipped through the hourglass, and the unprecedented momentum the armored units achieved up to that day absolutely could not be lost. However, the map of the war in Adolf Hitler's mind differed entirely from the tactical map sitting before his staff. Hitler viewed the war not merely as a military chessboard where divisions shifted positions, but as a colossal, ruthless struggle for survival that consumed all the natural resources and energies of nations. The idea that Germany suffered no military defeat in the trenches during the First World War, but rather surrendered to starvation and collapsed internally due to the British naval blockade and raw material shortages, etched itself deeply into his mind as an obsession. Therefore, he harshly accused his top generals of lacking vision and not understanding the slightest thing about the rigid realities of war economics. In Hitler's eyes, Moscow stood as a hollow target of prestige that would grace the headlines upon its capture, but would fail to fill the fuel tanks of the war machine. To sustain the war for many years, and to truly dominate the European continent against the United States and Britain, Germany urgently required raw materials and food. The true lifeblood lay not in the misty northern forests, but in the sun-scorched south. The endless golden wheat fields of Ukraine represented a colossal, inexhaustible granary that would feed the German army and the civilian population back in the homeland for years. The heavy industrial facilities, giant foundries, and rich coal mines in the Donbas Basin promised to provide an uninterrupted supply of the steel and energy demanded by the German war industry. More importantly, moving further south unlocked the gateway leading to the vast oil fields of the Caucasus. A motorized German army, consisting of thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of trucks, and massive air fleets, desperately needed blood, that is, oil, to survive. The Cold War within the headquarters, the countless memorandums, and the mutual accusations came to an end on August 21st, 1941, with a definitive directive penned by Hitler himself. The decision was absolute. The Army Group Center's offensive toward Moscow halted immediately. Horrified upon the order's arrival at the front headquarters, General Guderian jumped into his plane and flew to the center, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, to discuss the situation face to face with the Führer and steer him away from this fatal mistake. In the map room, Guderian stood before the generals and Hitler. He laid out in full clarity the physical limits of his soldiers, the worn-out engines of his panzers with their degraded tracks, and the massive psychological collapse that the fall of Moscow would trigger among the Soviet people. Yet, out of fear of Hitler's wrath, the other top commanders, including the commander-in-chief of the army Brauchitsch and Halder, remained silent and left Guderian entirely alone in this historic objection. Hitler interrupted Guderian and then launched into a long, heated monologue that lasted for hours. He expounded on the necessities of the war economy and the critical importance of Ukrainian wheat and oil. The decision made stood absolute, uncompromising, and final. Guderian left the room without achieving any results. Returning to the front the next day, Guderian ordered his army to execute one of the most arduous, exhausting, and unexpected maneuvers in military history. The colossal 2nd Panzer Group, which targeted Moscow and deployed in battle formation for that direction, suddenly shifted its course from east to south. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of half-track armored vehicles, and tens of thousands of infantrymen began advancing toward the Ukrainian plains in a sharp 90-degree turn, moving as a massive mass of steel. This enormous operational maneuver forced mechanical vehicles, already operating far beyond their maintenance limits, to cover hundreds of extra kilometers, consuming precious fuel and further exhausting the soldiers. Rolling south along dusty dirt roads, the armored columns set out toward a brand new objective: to slip behind the massive Soviet armies defending around Kiev. The shortest and most obvious path to Moscow fell into silence. The German war machine altered its strategic center of gravity by its own hands, focusing all its attention on the dark tragedy about to unfold around Kiev. Breaking away from Army Group Center and commencing a relentless march south, the 2nd Panzer Group under the command of General Heinz Guderian, surged forward, kicking up clouds of dust across the endless plains of Ukraine. This colossal steel spearhead of the German war machine drove hundreds of kilometers deep into Soviet lines. Simultaneously, from the south, the 1st Panzer Group, commanded by General Ewald von Kleist, crossed the Dnieper River and swiftly moved north to meet Guderian's forces. The German strategy envisioned these two colossal armored forces uniting in the heart of Ukraine, hundreds of kilometers east of Kiev, to envelop the massive Soviet southwestern front, defending the region from the rear. By mid-September, the vanguard units of the two armored corps greeted each other atop their mud and dust-covered tanks near the town of Lochwitza on September 16, 1941. The most massive steel pincer history had ever witnessed snapped shut with a deafening roar, completely severing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers around Kiev, along with the hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped inside from the outside world. Within this sealed massive pocket, the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, found itself in the midst of a total strategic catastrophe. The Soviet staff officers, who realized weeks earlier that German armor bypassed their flanks and slipped behind them, clearly saw the impending doom. Senior Soviet commanders, and even the chief of the general staff, Georgy Zhukov himself, repeatedly demanded the immediate abandonment of Kiev and the withdrawal of troops east of the Dnieper River to safer defensive lines to save the armies from absolute annihilation. Behind the thick walls of the Kremlin, however, military reality gave way to political stubbornness and paranoia. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin judged the word retreat as an act of treason. He relieved Zhukov of his duties and issued a single, uncompromising, and fatal order to the commanders in Kiev. The city would be defended at all costs, and not a single step back would be taken. Requests for a strategic withdrawal met categorical rejection. This rigid decision by Stalin sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and single-handedly locked an entire army group inside an inescapable ring of death. With the complete closure of the pocket, hellish days began for the besieged Soviet troops. Their logistical lines entirely severed and stripped of ammunition and food, the colossal army collapsed inward in despair. Under the relentless bombs rained down by the Luftwaffe from the sky, and the merciless pressure of the German infantry divisions, forming a wall of flesh around them, the Soviet resistance fractured piece by piece. Deprived of armored support, and gripped by hunger and thirst, tens of thousands of infantrymen launched suicidal bayonet charges in waves against German machine gun nests. However, each of these desperate breakout attempts resulted in a heavy bloodbath. Inside the pocket, the chain of command completely broke, units mixed together, and the regular army swiftly turned into a massive pile of wreckage. At the most desperate hour of the fighting, Soviet Commander General Kirponos and his staff fell into a German ambush in a wooded area while attempting to escape the front, and lost their lives in the firefight. For the hundreds of thousands of soldiers left leaderless, out of ammunition, and devoid of hope, resisting became physically impossible. In the final days of September, the gunfire in the Kiev pocket gave way to a deadly silence. The toll of the battlefield proved terrifying enough to push the limits of human comprehension. The greatest siege victory military history recorded up to that day belonged to the Germans. Yet for the Soviets, the price of this victory was an unprecedented tragic collapse. Exactly 665,000 Red Army soldiers laid down their weapons and surrendered to the German forces. This figure meant the total annihilation of an immense nation's entire armies in a single battle. Dirt roads stretching as far as the eye could see overflowed with convoys of exhausted, wounded, and starving prisoners that went on for kilometers. The immense Ukrainian plains transformed into the graveyard of the Soviet army. Hitler's decision to pivot south tactically yielded one of the greatest military victories in history. However, this massive operation of annihilation cost the German war machine invaluable weeks. While this magnificent triumph at Kiev was celebrated, the cold breath of the approaching Russian winter in the north and the center gradually began to make itself felt on the steel hulls of the panzers waiting on the roads to Moscow. As the massive tragedy unfolded around Kiev in the south, the Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leeb, at the northernmost edge of the front, approached its objective step by step, traversing the forests and swamps of the Baltic states. In early September, German mechanized and infantry units shattered the Soviet defenses and reached the banks of the Neva River. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured Shlisselburg and firmly established themselves on the southern shores of Lake Ladoga. This strategic advance entirely severed the final land connection between Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Soviet Union's second-largest city, and the rest of the country. Housing millions of civilians and a large army, the metropolis became trapped within a massive and unbreakable ring of steel. German artillery placed the city's outskirts, factories, and civilian settlements directly in its sights, and the first devastating shells mercilessly fell upon the historical capital of Tsarist Russia. In the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, the German High Command planned to capture the city directly and swiftly with an armored assault. However, the stubborn resistance encountered at Kiev and Smolensk, along with the immense military casualties brought by street fighting, dissuaded Hitler and his staff from this idea. They did not want armored units to fall into ambushes in narrow city streets or infantry divisions to melt away in a bloody urban warfare. Instead, the German army initiated one of the largest and most ruthless siege strategies in history. Rather than entering the city to fight, a decision was made to impose a prolonged blockade that would condemn the millions of civilians and Red Army soldiers inside to starvation and death within their own borders. All highways leading to the city were blocked, railway lines were torn up, communication cables were cut, and the colossal power plants feeding the city were bombed and disabled. The German army entrenched its massive artillery batteries, heavy machine gun nests, and infantry trenches around the city. The goal was not to conquer the city with a military victory, but to suffocate the life within it slowly, systematically, and pitilessly. As this deadly silence settled around the ring, the darkest period of the struggle for survival commenced for the 3 million people inside Leningrad. In the early days of the siege, on September 8th, German bombers targeted and struck with pinpoint accuracy the massive Badaev warehouses, the city's largest food reserve. Thousands of tons of flour, sugar, meat, and basic food supplies melted and turned to ash amid black smoke blanketing the sky. This fire acted as the first and most definitive harbinger of the impending catastrophe within the city. The food shortage began to make itself felt slowly, but with fatal certainty in the initial weeks. The daily bread rations distributed by the government were first halved and then reduced to pieces so small they could only be measured in grams, mixed with sawdust and ash. To survive, the civilian population resorted to boiling and eating grass from the streets, tree bark, leather belts, and shoes. In those same days, the color of the sky turned gray, and the first harsh winds of the approaching freezing Russian winter began to blow through the dark streets of the city, left without food, water, or firewood. Before the dust of the massive annihilation operation at Kiev even settled on the ground, the German High Command turned its gaze back to the true and ultimate target, Moscow. In the final days of September, a colossal plan named Operation Typhoon, aimed at capturing the capital directly, went into effect. Army Group Center received reinforcements forming the most immense armored force military history had ever seen up to that time. General Erich Huppner's 4th Panzer Group from the north, and General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, fresh from completing the Kiev victory in the south, were transferred to the center under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock through a massive logistical shift. 3 giant panzer armies lined up shoulder to shoulder on a single front at the entrance of the Moscow highway to breach the capital's gates, as the cool winds of autumn began to blow. The German soldiers were told that this colossal assault represented the final, decisive blow that would completely annihilate the enemy and end the war. On the morning of October 2nd, 1941, the main assault of Operation Typhoon commenced with a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth and sky. The Soviet High Command constructed deep, layered defensive lines in front of Moscow, dug by the labor of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Yet, the German armored spearheads tore through these lines like paper. Guderian's panzers advanced from the south on the Bryansk axis, while the forces of General Hermann Hoth and Huppner pushed from the north toward Vyazma simultaneously at a relentless pace. The Soviet armies attempted to mount a stiff resistance just as they did at Smolensk. However, they remained utterly helpless against the fatal speed, flawless air support, and maneuverability of the German armored pincers. In just a few days, on October 7th, the panzer columns linked up with incredible speed around both Vyazma and Bryansk to form 2 massive pockets. The last regular armies the Soviets deployed to the front to protect the capital were flawlessly trapped inside this steel snare. The Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements went down in history as almost an exact replica of the Kiev tragedy that unfolded just a few weeks prior. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers, trapped within the rings, resisted desperately for days, devoid of ammunition, fuel, and leadership. Beneath the unceasing bombardment of the Luftwaffe and the devastating fire of the German artillery, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were slowly torn apart in the massive woodlands. By mid-October, the resistance of the besieged Soviet troops shattered completely, and surrenders in colossal masses began. Over 600,000 more Soviet soldiers took the dark path to the prisoner camps. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and military vehicles were left to rust on the battlefield. The Soviet Western and Bryansk fronts, defending the capital, were effectively wiped off the map. Ahead of the German panzers, in the territory stretching all the way to Moscow, no significant regular military unit remained to protect the capital. When the news of this absolute and devastating collapse at the front reached Moscow, the Soviet capital experienced the greatest panic and chaos in its history. On October 15th, and the days that followed, giant bonfires were lit in government buildings, at the NKVD headquarters, and inside party centers. All secret state documents, archival records, and military plans were rapidly turned to ash so as not to fall into German hands. The black smoke rising from the chimneys of buildings and blanketing the sky transformed the anxiety among the civilian populace into sheer mass hysteria. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites flooded the train stations and the roads leading east to flee the city. Looting incidents broke out in the city. Public order deteriorated, and the unshakable authority of the state completely collapsed for a few days. A large portion of the Soviet government, ministries, and foreign diplomats were urgently evacuated on special trains to the eastern city of Kuibyshev. Combat engineers planted tons of explosives on the city's strategic bridges and factories. The hot breath of the enemy could be felt directly against the Kremlin walls, and the fall of Moscow was now viewed as an absolute certainty measured only in days. Towards the middle of October, the sky became veiled in heavy gray clouds. The expected autumn rains began to pour over the Russian steppes in a fine but unceasing rhythm. This was no ordinary transition of seasons, but the awakening of the Russian geography's greatest and most ruthless defensive weapon. Known in the local tongue as Rasputitsa, the season of roadlessness, this period swallowed the entire country as a colossal sea of mud. In this boundless geography, where asphalt roads scarcely existed, and transportation relied entirely on compacted dirt trails, the falling rain saturated the earth deeply and transformed the roads into virtually bottomless swamps. This natural phenomenon, well known to those who had lived on these lands for centuries and who shaped their lives around it, manifested as a fatal flaw and a strategic oversight that the German staff failed to foresee on their military maps. Every time the raindrops kissed the soil, an insurmountable wall was built in front of the German advance. The German war machine, having successfully closed the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets and advancing rapidly toward Moscow, slammed into this immense ocean of mud at a high velocity. The character of the war abruptly shifted from steel clashing against steel to a desperate battle of man and machine against nature. 30-ton Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, half-track vehicles, towing artillery batteries, and logistical supply trucks sank up to their wheels and hulls in this dark, sticky mire. The narrow tracks of the tanks could find no solid ground to grip in Russia's vast expanse of mud. Engines screamed in agony. Transmissions shattered from overloading, and engine blocks melted. Yet the colossal war machines could not move a single centimeter forward. Not only the machines, but hundreds of thousands of horses that formed the fundamental backbone of German logistics and shouldered a vast majority of the supply lines also suffered their share of this disaster. Horses trying to pull heavy loads sank up to their chests in the mud, and many lost their lives either when their hearts stopped from exhaustion or by drowning directly in the muck. German infantrymen were forced to slog through sticky and freezing cold mud that reached their knees, practically trying to swallow their boots with every step. Physical and psychological exhaustion permeated every cell of the seemingly unstoppable German army. The Lightning War, Blitzkrieg doctrine derived its core strength from mobility, speed, and catching the enemy off guard. However, the Rasputitsa completely paralyzed this massive mechanism engineered with military genius. The pace of the panzer divisions, accustomed to advancing tens of kilometers a day, plummeted to a mere few kilometers a day, and sometimes dropped to absolute zero. Supply convoys became hopelessly stuck on the roads just behind the front lines. Ammunition depots emptied, fuel tanks ran dry, and the soldiers' daily food rations were depleted. The armored units were forced to halt, not because of the Red Army's resistance, but due to nature's ruthless intervention. This stagnation became a literal lifeline of salvation for the Soviet Union. As the German army floundered helplessly in the mud and lost time, the final defensive perimeters before Moscow were fortified day by day through a collective effort involving hundreds of thousands of civilians working shoulder to shoulder. Utilizing this crucial time gained, the Soviet High Command rapidly deployed fresh, winter-hardened Siberian divisions brought in from the Japanese border to the defense of the capital. Nature severed the fatal momentum of the German army, gradually and irreversibly shifting the initiative of the war. By mid-November, the gray and wet atmosphere over the Russian steppes suddenly gave way to a biting frost. The Rasputitsa, which swallowed the German war machine for weeks and trapped panzers and logistical convoys in knee-deep bogs, surrendered to a merciless cold. Temperatures suddenly plummeted below zero, and nature altered the form of the weapon it wielded against its enemy. The sea of mud froze solid within just a few days. Deep rutted tire tracks, mud pits, and fields of sludge practically transformed into stone-hard obstacles. This sudden freeze created a brief and deceptive sense of relief within the German High Command. For the armored divisions, mired in the mud for weeks, regained their mobility over the frozen ground. Tank tracks no longer sank into the earth, heavy artillery broke free from the mud, and the German army believed it found that final momentum required to capture the capital, Moscow. However, this frozen terrain brought with it fatal and unforeseen new disasters. The return of mobility marked the beginning of an absolute physical nightmare for the German soldiers. While planning Operation Barbarossa, the German staff believed the war ended in a decisive victory before winter arrived, at the latest during the autumn months. This massive strategic fallacy tore an irreparable gap in the logistical planning of the colossal army. No winter equipment suitable for the freezing conditions of the Russian winter reached this immense force of over 3 million soldiers. When the freezing winds of November began to blow across the open terrain, the Wehrmacht soldiers still wore thin summer uniforms, cotton jackets, and hobnailed leather boots. The cold pierced ruthlessly into the bodies of the soldiers. Lacking wool gloves, thick winter coats, and snow camouflage, the soldiers wore the clothing of dead Soviet soldiers, stuffed newspapers inside their uniforms, and wrapped any scraps of fabric they found around their faces to avoid freezing to death. Not only the human body, but also the invincible machines of the Lightning War faced this relentless cold entirely unprepared. German industry failed to produce and deliver a sufficient amount of antifreeze to the vehicles on the Eastern Front. As temperatures rapidly crashed to sub-zero levels, the engine blocks of tanks and trucks cracked, and engine oils froze into a solid pitch. Soldiers were forced to light perilous fires underneath the vehicles in the mornings just to start the engines. The mechanisms of the weapons jammed due to the frozen oils, and machine guns failed to fire. The stone-hard bumps created by the frozen mud shattered the suspension systems and broke the tracks of moving tanks. Despite all this physical and mechanical devastation, the German staff decided to continue the offensive. Both the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, and the headquarters in Berlin believed that the Soviet army suffered equal exhaustion and that the Red Army faced complete collapse with one final heavy blow. The Wehrmacht stood at the literal point of physical and psychological ruin. The strength of the companies fell by half, and the soldiers battled hunger, fatigue, and the freezing cold. Nevertheless, acting on the belief that the fall of Moscow meant the end of the war, the German army mobilized its last remaining energy, its final drop of fuel, and its ultimate ammunition reserves. On November 15, 1941, German armor surged forward once again with a deafening roar across the frozen ground. This offensive represented not an act of logic and precaution, but the last desperate flutter of hope from an army on the brink of exhaustion. The target rested just a few dozen kilometers away, the Kremlin. By the final days of November, the exhausted and freezing units of the German army made one last desperate push toward the outskirts of Moscow. The armored groups of General Heinz Guderian and General Erich Höppner pierced through the Soviet defensive lines at the cost of heavy casualties. The vanguard reconnaissance units and motorcycle infantry attached to the 2nd Panzer Division formed the absolute tip of this relentless march. During the darkest days of November, these vanguard units managed to enter the town of Khimki, located a mere 30 kilometers from the center of Moscow. This location went down in history as the furthest, deepest point the German army ever reached in the east. The roar of battle now echoed directly through the streets of Moscow and across Red Square. Civilians in the city center watched the flashes of artillery fire illuminating the horizon with their naked eyes. The German officers, entering the town of Khimki and taking positions on the surrounding high hills, turned their binoculars toward the horizon where the freezing wind blew. Beneath the foggy and gray sky, the silhouette of Moscow appeared on the snow-covered skyline. Through the lenses of their binoculars, the officers clearly saw the towers of the Kremlin, the colossal state buildings, and the domes of historic churches. The ultimate victory Adolf Hitler promised them for months stood right before them, just a short tank ride away. Yet, this sight served not as the harbinger of a monumental military triumph, but as the most agonizing reflection of an unreachable mirage. The German army saw the target with its own eyes, but failed to find the physical, military, and mechanical strength within itself to cross those final 30 kilometers. The soldiers' muscles froze, their willpower weakened, and their fighting capability utterly vanished on those snow-covered hills. Approaching the early days of December, the ruthless nature of Russia delivered its final and most lethal blow. Thermometers suddenly crashed to minus 30 degrees and even plummeted to minus 40 degrees during certain hours of the night. A cold of this magnitude fundamentally altered the nature of warfare and transcended the limits of human comprehension. The breeches of the artillery froze solid. The fine oils inside the machine guns petrified and shattered the mechanisms, rendering the weapons entirely incapable of firing. The fluids within the engine blocks of the Panzer solidified completely. Operating the colossal war machines became physically impossible. Blizzards descending from the sky with a deadly silence froze thousands of waiting German soldiers to death right in their trenches, still clutching their weapons. That massive and invincible armored army, which gazed upon the Kremlin's towers from Khimki, practically transformed into ice sculptures within the -30-degree hell. The gates of Moscow cracked open for the Germans, but the army meant to cross that threshold already perished beneath the freezing cold and the White Death. As German soldiers froze to death at -30 degrees just outside Moscow, the fate of the war took shape thousands of kilometers away, inside a secret radio room in the Japanese capital of Tokyo. Since the beginning of the war, the Soviet Union lived in fear of a two-front conflict, its greatest strategic nightmare. In the east, along the Manchurian border, a massive and powerful Japanese army stood ready to attack at any moment. For this reason, even as Moscow stood on the brink of falling, Stalin was forced to keep his most elite and winter-hardened military units in Siberia, stationed along the far east border. However, amidst this dark and desperate picture, the legendary spy Richard Sorge, working for the Red Army's main intelligence directorate, GRU, stepped onto the stage. Sorge deeply infiltrated the German embassy in Tokyo and the highest echelons of the Japanese High Command. In the autumn of 1941, Sorge transmitted a vital message to Moscow that completely altered the course of the war. The Japanese Empire decided to direct its military weight not to the north against the Soviet Union, but to the south, toward the Pacific Ocean and the United States of America. It became an absolute certainty that Japan planned no attack on Siberia. Joseph Stalin, who ignored Sorge's warnings at the outset of Operation Barbarossa, this time fully believed the certainty of the intelligence and took immediate action. With this strategic decision made, one of the largest and swiftest logistical shifts in military history commenced. The Trans-Siberian Railway flowed westward continuously, day and night without pause. The Siberian and Far East divisions, consisting of hundreds of thousands of fully equipped, fresh soldiers accustomed to -40 degrees, were rapidly transported from the Manchurian border to the Moscow front. While the German soldiers froze in their thin summer uniforms, these newly arrived Soviet troops wore thick wool coats, white snow camouflage, and traditional Valenki felt boots that protected their feet from the freezing cold. The mechanisms of their weapons were cleaned with special, non-freezing winter oils, and their tanks possessed wide tracks designed to move smoothly over the snow without sinking. Raised in the harshest geography of the Soviet Union, these soldiers viewed the winter itself not as an enemy, but as their greatest military ally. As this fresh and massive military force amassed around Moscow, the defense command of the capital was handed over entirely to General Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov managed this immense power entrusted to him under a veil of strict secrecy. Maskirovka, military deception and camouflage, one of the most crucial elements of Soviet military doctrine, was flawlessly executed. Trains arriving from Siberia pulled into the stations only under the pitch-black cover of night, and the soldiers swiftly concealed themselves within deep forested areas. Radio silence was enforced as an absolute rule. German reconnaissance planes remained grounded due to severe blizzards, leaving German intelligence completely oblivious to this colossal army assembling right under their noses. The German staff officers believed they faced nothing more than the exhausted dying remnants of a Red Army on the verge of collapse. In reality, deep within the snow-covered, dark forests of Moscow, Zhukov quietly sharpened a massive and completely fresh spear, poised to strike directly into the heart of the German war machine. The initiative of the war slowly slipped through the frozen fingers of the Germans. At the dawn of December 5th, 1941, the terrifying storm that broke out over the snow-covered front line outside Moscow served not merely as a freezing natural phenomenon, but as the harbinger of a colossal fury that forever altered the course of the war. Amidst a howling wind and heavy snowfall, completely blanketing the sky, the Soviet forces commanded by General Georgy Zhukov launched a full-scale counteroffensive with a ferocity the Germans never even imagined. Hundreds of thousands of fresh, fully equipped, and winter-acclimatized Siberian and Far East soldiers who waited for weeks in the depths of the forests in pitch darkness and absolute radio silence, poured over the German lines like an avalanche in their white camouflage. Thousands of artillery barrels fired simultaneously, and Katyusha rocket launcher batteries tore through the Moscow skies, turning the German trenches into a lake of fire. The wide tracks of the T-34 tanks crushed through the thick layer of snow as they advanced. The German High Command and the soldiers at the front, expecting to face an utterly exhausted army, were caught completely blind and defenseless against this massive, fresh military force forged from the union of nature and steel. In the opening hours of the offensive, the German lines, on the verge of freezing to death, entirely out of ammunition, and pushed far beyond their physical limits, tore like paper before this unexpected and violent blow. With their weapons jammed from the cold, and their engines failing to start due to the ice, the Wehrmacht soldiers found absolutely no physical or mechanical strength to fight back against the fresh Red Army troops bearing down on them. For the first time, German infantrymen, who knew no defeat for years and crushed Europe from end to end, abandoned their trenches, leaving their heavy weapons, tanks, and frozen comrades behind in the snow, and began to flee chaotically toward the west. A massive wave of panic spread across the front lines of the German army. Communication lines severed, the chain of command shattered, and in some sectors, units completely disintegrated, vanishing into the white hell surrounding them. The Russian winter and the relentless fury of the Red Army suffocated the German war machine within its own steel and arrogance. This sudden and devastating collapse at the front sent a massive shockwave through the German command structure. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, confronted the bitter face of military reality upon seeing the advance halt and his troops literally freeze out of existence. To prevent the total annihilation of his units and save what remained of his army, he issued a retreat order to his troops, acting without waiting for instructions from Berlin or in direct defiance of them. Not only Guderian, but other senior commanders in Army Group Center also found themselves forced to pull their units kilometers back to more defensible lines to avert the disaster of their armies. The unstoppable advance of Operation Barbarossa up to that day met a definitive, ruthless, and bloody end in the snow-covered forests of Moscow on December 5th. When the news of the retreat outside Moscow reached the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler reacted with immense fury that the generals under his command took the initiative to shift the armies westward. He harbored a profound fear of a repeat of the famous and chaotic collapse of Napoleon's army in the snows. On December 19, 1941, Hitler issued the definitive and uncompromising Haltbefehl, stand-fast order, that went down in German military history. The soldiers received orders not to take a single step back, to defend every meter of the front line to their last drop of blood, and to take cover by blowing up and digging into the frozen ground with hand grenades. The highest-ranking and most experienced commanders who objected to this order or advocated for a strategic retreat, such as Commander-in-Chief of the Army Walther von Brauchitsch, General Heinz Guderian, and General Erich Hupner, faced immediate dismissal. Hitler personally assumed the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Army. This decision served as a ruthless death warrant that left the frontline soldiers alone to face the perils of starvation and freezing at -40 degrees. However, from the perspective of military strategy, it narrowly prevented the German army from spiraling into total chaos and the entire front from collapsing entirely. Assuming circular defensive positions called hedgehogs in the villages and vital road junctions they occupied, the German troops resisted desperately against the massive waves of the Red Army. The Soviet counteroffensive continued with all its ferocity until January 1942. General Zhukov's relentless pressure and armored spearheads tore the German Army Group center away from the gates of Moscow, driving them 100 to 250 kilometers west of the capital. The German soldiers who gazed upon the Kremlin's towers through binoculars just weeks prior now fought for survival amidst the snows, far away from those very towers. The direct German threat surrounding Moscow disappeared entirely. That unshakable German belief of a victory within a few weeks gave way to a dark and bloody uncertainty. Regarded as the most invincible army in the world that brought continental Europe to its knees in mere months, the Wehrmacht suffered the first major and heavy defeat in its history. The myth of the German army's invincibility shattered in the freezing forests of Moscow, and the absolute reality that the war entered a much bloodier and more ruthless phase was etched into history. As the final days of 1941 faded into the past, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion plan human history witnessed up to that day, officially ended without achieving its ultimate objectives. The Soviet Union did not collapse, the Red Army did not perish, and Moscow did not fall. The doctrine of the lightning war, Blitzkrieg, went entirely bankrupt in the face of Russia's boundless geography, ruthless climate, and the inexhaustible manpower of the Soviet people. The war of speed, pace, and rapid encirclement maneuvers came to a close. Replacing it was a merciless war of attrition, where steel ground against steel, man crushed man, and resources and national industries clashed to their very last drop. The Eastern Front transformed into a colossal point of no return, a massive graveyard for both sides. Those freezing nights outside Moscow marked not just the end of an operation, but the permanent dawn of a bloody darkness that cost millions of lives and endured for years. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.